join this evening, but especially thank Tabitha for coming and agreeing to do this about her new book, the Cunning. Tabitha is obviously an author, but she's also a doctor. She's a postgraduate researcher on the 7-county witch hunt project, investigating the people affected by the 1640s witchcraft trials in Eastern England, which is a very similar project to RAWS. She is a specialist in English magic and witchcraft between the 14th and 17th centuries, and she has a particular interest in the supernatural. She has previously written a book called Love Spells and Lost Treasure, Service Magic in England and the Later Middle Ages to the Early Modern Period. If anybody wants to read that, you can get that from Cambridge University Press. And of course, the book that we're here to discuss this evening, Cunning Folk, Life in the Age of Practical Magic. She has, like I said, taught at various English universities, currently at Exeter. She has done various podcasts, TVs, and radio shows, and folklore podcasts. You can listen to her on BBC 4's Plague Fiction, and BBC Radio 3's Witchcraft, Werewolves, and Writing the Devil. She's, like I said, she teaches at various universities across the south and southwest of England, and some of the subjects she's taught has been history, English, and sustainable development. Just to name a few things that this wonderful lady has achieved. So this evening, we'd like everybody to welcome Tabitha to talk about her book, The Cunning.
Okay, thank you. Just before you go, Sheila, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, brilliant, thanks. Okay, I want to start by saying that you make me sound way more impressive than I think I am. But thank you anyway, that was a lovely introduction. And I just want to say I did my undergrad at Edinburgh, so I do have a Scottish connection in there somewhere, even though it's a while back and I can't actually claim to be Scottish, which is a shame because it's brilliant. So I thought I would start by reading a bit of the introduction of Cunning Folk. I'm just showing it again because it's got a really pretty cover and I'm quite proud of the cover. The US version is bright pink and that's also quite exciting, but I just think this one's a little bit more mystical and I quite like it. So I'll start with a little reading and then I'll talk a bit about my methodology, how I got interested in this subject in the first place, and kind of what I've got out of it, and yeah, kind of a little bit about what I'm working on now as well, because as Sheila said, I am currently on the 7-county witch hunt project, which is looking at the Matthew Hopkins witch trials of 1640s England, which was the biggest sort of witch hunt that England ever had, at least. We're doing quite a lot of interesting work there, so hopefully it'll be interesting to RAWS. But yes, I will start with a little reading from my book. And if you've already bought a copy of this or you've already started reading this, I'm sorry, this will be not new information, but for those of you who haven't, which is probably most of you, yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting. So, in the autumn of 1637, Mabel Grey lost some spoons. After a morning spent tearing her house apart, she asked her neighbours for help in their recovery. Unfortunately, no one had seen them, but Mabel's friends suggested that she could seek out a magician who might be able to help find the missing cutlery. Thus began a long journey across London, during which Mabel visited some of the seediest areas of the capital and met several wizards in the hope of getting back what was hers. She went first to a cunning woman, the kind of practitioner who specialised in simple spells, in Southwark. Travelling from her home in Westminster, Mabel would have had to catch a ferry across the Thames, probably disembarking at Stangate Stairs on the river's bank opposite Westminster Hall. Passing the warm red walls of Lambeth Palace on her right, she then walked about 2 miles east, across fields filled with livestock to meet this magician. The journey was in vain, however. The court document that records Mabel's adventure tells us that the cunning woman was unable to help. Perhaps she didn't specialise in this sort of magic, for she recommended a man near Drury Lane who could supernaturally recover lost or stolen goods. The cunning woman gave Mabel an address. Mabel followed the directions, paying the ferryman a halfpenny to recross the river before heading west. Lutner's Lane, where this second magician lived, was not a notable or salubrious location. John Strype's 1720 edition of A Survey of the Cities of London and Westminster describes it as a very ordinary place, and but of small account either for buildings or inhabitants. To an 18th century reader, this description would carry a sniff of derision. The buildings were probably in poor repair, and small account suggests that the inhabitants were likely to be, well, not particularly respectable, let's say. Nevertheless, Mabel was determined. She knocked at the cunning man's door and explained her situation, begging for help in finding her spoons. The magician listened sympathetically, but unfortunately he couldn't help either. He, in turn, suggested that she go and see a third wizard, a certain Mr. Tunn, who knew how to recover lost goods like hers. He lived not far away, she was told, in Ram Alley just off of Fleet Street. This news must have been a mixed blessing for Mabel. On the one hand, Mr. Tunn was close by, and Mabel's feet must have been starting to ache at this point. On the other, if Lutner's Lane was considered ordinary, Ram Alley was considered debauched. Strype's survey tells us that it was a street taken up by public houses, and a privileged place for debtors, meaning that it was a safe place for debtors and other criminals to lie low. The alley's reputation might explain why Mabel paid the cunning man, the second cunning man, 3 shillings to go with her to see Mr. Tunn. She may not have felt safe going alone. Fortunately, the wizard agreed, and they set off to find the third, and hopefully the final magician. At last, Mabel found a practitioner who claimed he could help. She agreed to pay Mr. Tunn 5 shillings in cash and a further 3 in wine to tell her where the spoons were, and if they had been stolen, by whom. The answer, unfortunately, that she got was vague, but it was delivered with confidence. Tunn assured her that the thief was in the house that had the spoons, and the spoons should come again, they should know not how, and be laid in the same place from whence they were taken. Basically, the spoons are somewhere, someone knows where they are, but they will be coming back. Why did Mabel spend an entire day travelling across London and had spent at least 11 shillings, which is about a week's pay for a skilled tradesman, to find these cunning folk? It's obvious that her spoons were incredibly valuable to her. In a time before mass production, even simple household utensils were time-consuming to make and worth keeping for decades. If they were made of metal, or especially silver, they might have been her most valuable items, perhaps even her sole inheritable property. Recovering them, therefore, was worth her time and money. But in a world where there was no formal police force or insurance, who could help when such valuable items were lost? For Mabel and many others like her, the first port of call was often a magician. So that's the intro, well, the part of an intro. And hopefully it gives you an idea of my writing style, which I hope you like, but also it gives you an idea of the kinds of people I'm interested in and what I was looking at in this book. It's very much a book about people, their everyday problems, ranging from having lost an everyday item all the way up to something that's, sort of life or death, like a literal dangerous illness, or a sort of, in some cases, whether or not somebody's going to inherit a kingdom. And in all of these situations, whether they're mundane or really quite special, people would turn to magicians for help. Male and female, rich, poor, whatever age, people were looking for magical help. And that surprised me. This isn't what I expected to find when I started my research into this topic. And I figured that if it's surprising to me, then maybe it's surprising to other people as well. And thus, Cunning Folk was born. But I'm going to talk, to start with, about how I came to do this research in the first place, because it was a little bit wiggly, and my methodology, and sort of how I started doing this research, and then how the research progressed, and why I think there's still so much more to find. So I started out by being really interested in, as most people are, and as I'm sure we all are, the witch trials. As I say, I did my undergrad at Edinburgh, and I was absolutely fascinated by the courses that were offered there about the witch hunts across Europe and North America in the early modern period, in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I was also really interested in the gender question. You know, why were so many people who were accused of witchcraft women? Why were there so few men? And that is the thing that I decided to do my undergrad dissertation on, exploring this kind of gender question. But because there was already so much written from the sort of, you know, approach from the kind of the sort of the female persecuted side, I decided I would look at it from a kind of male angle instead, to see why we do have some male witches, despite the kind of the strong misogyny and the strong stereotyping that there is about witches being women. So I did my, as I say, undergrad dissertation on that, and looked at the male witches that I found in England specifically, because it's only 8,000 words long, 10,000 words long, I think. And you know, there was no way that I could cover the entirety of Europe or more than one country at the time. And also the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft hadn't actually been published at that point. So yeah, I didn't really have a database to work with in Scotland in the same way that there was in England. So I started looking at this. And I was surprised at some of the statistics I found. I found that in the witch hunts I'm now looking at, the Matthew Hopkins ones, it was 90% women accused and only 10% men. But then in Normandy and in Iceland, it was 90% men who were accused of witchcraft and only 10% women, which is, you know, surprising. And I thought that was quite interesting. So then I decided that I would do a PhD on this topic because, you know, who doesn't love reading books and crying a lot for 4 years? And so I applied to do a PhD on that, and I got accepted to do it at the University of Bristol under Professor Ronald Hutton. And yeah, I thought, great, I'm going to do male witchcraft, and hopefully that will shed more light on sort of on the female aspect of this question, but also give us a much sort of more rounded view of what was going on with witchcraft in this period. A couple of things got in the way of that. I shortly afterwards discovered that there was somebody else who was doing a PhD on male witchcraft in England at the same time, who had started the year before me. And so that was kind of horrifying. So I kind of thought I'd have to pivot anyway, but then I started doing sort of more research into the kinds of men who were accused of magical practice in one form or another. And I realized that there were more categories to magic than I expected. Obviously, which is you know, the well-known one, and obviously you've got all sorts of stereotypes around that about sort of, you know, kind of like old, ugly, scary people who have sold their souls to the devil and do evil things to their neighbors. And that is, you know, that was a kind of witch, obviously, that you all know, was targeted in the early modern period, and very much a kind of very present part of early modern culture. That a lot of people sort of feared and lambasted and did all sorts of kind of, as you know, horrible things to. But then I also, in collecting all these cases of sort of male magical practitioners, discovered that there were other kinds of magical practitioner out there as well. And these were getting ahead of myself, ritual magicians, who are kind of the sort of John Dee figure, or the Dr. Faustus, or the Merlin kind of person who has, you know, strong knowledge of astronomy and astrology, can do all sorts of incredible mathematical calculations that I will never understand, and use these somehow to summon spirits or control angels, and sort of bend the universe to their will, or at least that's what they claim to do. And they were seen in their own time as very separate to witches. These were kind of people who, like, the twain never met. Even if you were accused of male, you know, being a male witch, you wouldn't, you know, that wasn't normally something that would be associated with a ritual magician. But then there was also this third category, which was cunning folk, and those are the kind of people who just practice everyday mundane spells to do things like heal, and sort of find where your cow has disappeared off to and that kind of thing. And so I got really interested in why I'd never really come across cunning folk or ritual magicians before. So I sort of fell down that rabbit hole and thought, okay, well, I'm going to look at sort of male magical practitioners, and I'm going to have a chapter on witches, I'm going to have a chapter on ritual magicians, and I'm going to have a chapter on cunning folk. And I thought I'd start with cunning folk because I had Owen Davies' book, which is called, I think it's Practical Magic, A History of Cunning Folk in England or something like that. It's really good. I would definitely recommend reading it. Came out in 2007, I think. And I had a copy of that in my hand at the time. So I thought, okay, well, I'll start with this and I'll sort of apply a kind of gendered lens to it, and we'll see where this goes. And I did that. And then from being one chapter of my thesis, cunning folk just became the entire thing. Because there was just so much that hasn't been looked at and hadn't been sort of really thought about. There's a lot of assumptions made about people who I kind of am calling cunning folk for shorthand, but nobody had really checked, because they're mentioned sort of casually all the time in late medieval and early modern texts. They come up in witch trials often, often as the person accusing a witch, because they had spells that they could use to identify who a witch was. And so, if they assumed that somebody had been, if somebody is afraid that their neighbor has been cursing them, then you might go to a cunning person to have that confirmed, and then buy some counter magic to reverse the curse, and then identify who had done it in the first place. So then you get cunning folk actually turning up in witch trials as prosecutors. And that just kind of blew my mind, because it's so much more complex than I realized at the time. And so I thought, well, okay, so why haven't I ever heard of this? And why is it that these people didn't seem to be prosecuted very often for being, oh, thank you, Tina. Yes, popular magic, cunning folk and English history. Yes. Yeah, why is it that these people weren't prosecuted as witches, given that they were also practicing magic? So yeah, kind of ballooned. I didn't really end up touching witches at all during my thesis, which is not what I intended at all. And as I say, I'm kind of making up for that now with the Seven County Witch Hunt project. But I did start looking at ritual magicians as well, because I noticed that even though they are very impressive people who have big beards and impressive hats, and normally have a very good education and understand, as I say, mathematical things that I will never understand, ritual magicians still seem to be using magic for similar purposes to your humble, everyday cunning person. So whereas a cunning man might find lost and stolen goods by picking up a Bible, holding it between their hands and saying, Roger stole the spoons, and then seeing whether the Bible fell out of his hands or not, a ritual magician might summon a demon to do the same job. So even though they're using completely different methods, the actual outcomes are often the same. And this applies to all sorts of different types of things that you might use magic for. So some of the things that cunning folk would often do is love magic, either causing people to fall in love or to fall out of love, or something in between. There's a lot of lust in there as well. Or finding buried treasure was very common, because everybody likes to basically win the lottery overnight. And what was another one? Well, healing as well comes up very often as the kind of thing that a cunning person would offer. And ritual magicians are using these incredibly complex, very dangerous types of magic that, as I say, often involve sort of summoning and controlling demons, but for exactly the same purposes, just in a much more complex way. So that's when I adopted this term service magic, which was originally come up with by Ronald, and I thought, oh, that's good. So I used it and sort of applied it to see whether it's works in my period, and yes, it does. Basically, there's a whole slew of people living in early modern England and other countries as well, but I haven't been able to research them personally, who would offer magic as a service. And what was really surprising about all of this is that they were treated differently to people who were prosecuted as witches. There's very little overlap between these people, at least in England. There are exceptions to that. For example, oh goodness, what's her name? Oh no, oh, it's completely gone out of my head. Sorry, it's been a very long day. Oh, St. Osyth's case. Begins with an A. It'll come back to me as soon as I stop thinking about it. Woman started out as a cunning woman, did a lot of healing in her village, well, in St. Osyth's, and she would often heal children. And then eventually she gets accused of murdering children through magic, and then she gets accused as a witch, and she is executed, and it's brutal. It's incredibly unfair. She's clearly been, contributing to her community and been a very trusted part of her community for a very long time. And then because a couple of children die under her care, the community turns against her. But as I say, I was surprised that these are quite unusual and quite rare cases. Most of the time, people would see cunning folk or service magicians as quite different, and not see them as a threat. And that's also reflected in the law in England in the 16th century and the 17th century. So Henry VIII, that guy, introduced the first law against witchcraft in England in 1542. And he basically outlaws both service magic and kind of using demons to harm people, which I'm going to use as shorthand to say to witchcraft. He outlaws both and says it's death penalty for both cunning magic and malevolent witchcraft. What's really interesting is that this law is never actually used to its fullest extent in England, because nobody wants to murder people who they think are doing good through their magic. So it's only in Elizabeth I's reign when we get the Second Witchcraft Act from 1563, when we actually start seeing people really being prosecuted for magical activity. But even that law makes a distinction between cunning magic and malevolent witchcraft. So the first part of the act says witches are banned, essentially, because anybody who uses spirits to, or conjure spirits to harm, destroy, or otherwise affect somebody's body or livestock or property, the penalty is death, essentially. What's interesting is that when it comes to service magic, it's a little bit more gentle. I'm not saying it's a nice consequence, but if you are a cunning person and you use magic or enchantments or sorceries, and it has various different words that it uses for magic, to provoke unlawful love. We could debate what unlawful love is, but yeah, provoke unlawful love, find lost or stolen goods, find buried treasure, or I think predict the future, then the punishment is imprisonment for 1 year. And then on the second offence, it is death. Again, this was pretty much never used, at least to its fullest extent. People were imprisoned sometimes for doing these things, but not often. Most of the time, using magic was basically the church and the state just turned a blind eye to it, so long as it wasn't doing any harm. When the state gets interested was during times when the magic was causing some kind of disruption. So, for example, a lot of the cases that I discuss in my book are from either the church courts or the kind of the local sort of magistrates' courts, basically. Because the magic has caused some kind of disruption. So there's quite a few cases of people using magic to discover who had stolen their spoons. Just going to carry on using spoons as an example. And that's fine. The courts don't care about that. What they do care about is false accusations. So if a magician says, yes, it was Bert stole your spoons, and then Margaret goes and accuses Bert of stealing these spoons, and he hasn't done it, then that's slander, and all of a sudden the courts are interested, because slander it's a real problem for small communities. So at that point, a cunning person will be blamed for basically causing upset in their community. Otherwise, they don't really get mentioned, or if they do get mentioned, as I say, it's as part of a wider trial looking at potentially witchcraft, or potentially a larger theft case or something like that, where a cunning person is mentioned incidentally as one of the givers of evidence, or somebody who originally sort of pointed something in the right direction, so they found evidence. Which actually made this subject really hard to research because they just, yeah, people didn't really care about cunning folk. Not in history since, and not really at the time. And I started thinking about cunning folk a little bit like dentists, which I know sounds absurd, but they inhabited this kind of weird social role where they were doing something which was technically illegal, and therefore you probably shouldn't admit to going to use them. And in a similar way, nobody likes to go see the dentist. However, dentists do really useful things that we all need. And similarly, cunning folk would do really useful things that we all need, even if you avoid going if you possibly can. They also get paid incredibly well, both dentists and cunning folk, or at least they could be paid very well if people thought that their services were worth having. But like that, cunning folk are very hard to track down because we don't often get, records of dentists nowadays. Nobody's writing sort of great novels about dentists, no offense to dentists, and nobody's really kind of reporting them in any particular way. They're just sort of part of the fabric of our society. They're part of our everyday life that we need to use. They're not exciting, unlike persecuted witches, who obviously they had a lot of things written about them because it was sensational. People don't report in newspapers going to the dentist, but they do report murders. And similarly, nobody was really talking about cunning folk in a big way. It was just, sort of a kind of everyday humdrum thing. And then the darker side of magical practice with witchcraft, that is what people started talking about. So that is why my methodology was all over the place when I started this research, because it was a bit like finding needles in haystacks. I went through so many church court records to try to find misdemeanors that mention cunning folk. I looked at a lot of plays, because even though a lot of plays don't really, sort of strongly feature cunning folk, they often do pop up in the background with surprising sort of frequency. For example, in what's it called? Well, in Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor, for example, Falstaff, when he's trying to seduce one of the women in Windsor, he tries to sneak into her house, and she says, "Oh yes, you're very welcome into my house. Come and seduce me." Little does he know that she's actually playing a trick on him. And so she immediately allows Falstaff into her house, and then says, "Oh no, my husband's coming home. Quick, dress up as the wise woman of Brentford," in this sort of kind of in this sort of dress that she had left over from her washing day. And so Falstaff panics and gets in this dress, and then sort of walks out the house, and this woman's husband attacks Falstaff, thinking that the Falstaff is this cunning woman, because, as I say, cunning folk had this kind of like slightly dodgy reputation as being possibly useful, possibly not somebody you should deal with. So having a cunning person in your house could often be a sort of a potential stain against your character, potentially. But yeah, so Shakespeare has a cunning woman in the Merry Wives of Windsor, even though it's not a real one. Falstaff then walks home. He's battered and bruised. He's very miserable, but he's followed all the way home by people who then start asking him for spells because they think that he is a wise woman. So he's asked to recover a golden chain that has been lost by somebody's master. I think he's also sort of being shouted at down the street, like, what's going to happen to my children and that kind of thing, and sort of asked to do fortune telling. So they often pop up in the background of bigger stories that we all kind of potentially know, but we don't really notice there are cunning folk there. So yeah, so I use plays, I use church court records and some secular court records. I've also used things like medicine books and recipe books, because often, even in completely mainstream medicine, especially in the medieval period, people were, well, sort of highly trained physicians would use spells as part of their healing practices. So you might prescribe somebody, I don't know, powdered pearl or something like that to help cleanse their stomach, but you might also give them a little written charm to wear around their neck at the same time to help purify their system, or even feed them particular foods that has like the shape of a cross carved into it, as well as a little charm kind of written into it or something like that. So yeah, magic pops up all over the place, and its place in society is just really complex and surprising, but it's everywhere. It was really embedded, and I think it's really useful to think about cunning folk, especially when you're thinking about witchcraft, because they're they're working with the same forces often. They are kind of both sort of supernatural, well, people with supernatural powers, or perceived to be people with supernatural powers, and they're rubbing alongside each other, and it's along with the rest of society, and they're viewed very differently by their neighbours. But I don't know. It really shook me to realise that there was more to the magical landscape of the early modern period than just persecution and just negative views of magic. But in fact, actually, it was everywhere instead. Um, so yeah. So something I haven't really touched on at all is who service magicians were and who their clients were. And as I say, I started off by looking at sort of examples of male magical practitioners. And then when I decided to focus solely on cunning folk, I realized that actually that wasn't going to work. I'm glad it didn't, because there were both, well, cunning folk were men and women. I was actually really surprised because I compiled about 550 cases of cunning folk sort of running around England doing interesting things. And it was pretty much exactly a 50-50 split, male and female. Practitioners. I think it was slightly higher male. I think it was 52% to 48% or something like that. But it's largely 50-50. And with only 550 cases, I couldn't really say that that's a hard and fast split anyway. But yeah. And as I say, most of the people who practiced cunning magical service magic weren't prosecuted as witches at any point. And they were often actually heralded as quite, very useful people in their community. As I say, they were still kind of held at arm's length a lot of the time because they were dealing with forces which were incredibly powerful, and not everybody knew how to use them, so they could be quite scary figures in that sense. But in other ways, they weren't. They were just seen as very, very useful, and we even have cases of clients of cunning folk standing up in court and saying, yes, I did employ this magician. Yes, I'm aware that it's illegal. However, it worked, and it was really useful, and I would do it again, which is an incredibly brave thing to do for sort of a normal person to stand up in court and sort of defend a magician like that. But they did do it. And the particular case I have in mind, which I'll need to look up in the book, but it was a male client defending a female cunning woman in that case. And you even sometimes have cunning folk prosecuting people for slandering them or for attacking them and calling them witches, and they kind of say, no, I'm not a witch, I'm a cunning person. And then the court takes their side and says, yes, you're right, that is unfair, that people are claiming that you use maleficium because you're clearly just doing good instead. So it's utterly bizarre. Anyway, sorry, that was a slight tangent. So yeah, cunning folk, they could be male, they could be female, they could be pretty much any age. Probably not, well, actually no, they could be children as well, because you'd sometimes have magicians who would have a sort of a child helper, because children are meant to be more psychic, basically. So if you are trying to find a lost or stolen item, or you're trying to locate a missing person, then you might employ a child with magical ability to help you do it. And then you also have people in their 80s and 90s who are also have been practicing magic for 30, 40 years and say this in no uncertain terms in the records that we have surviving about them, that they had this very long kind of magical career. They could also come from basically any social status, from the kind of the sort of traveling salesman or a laborer or a cattle herd or something like that could have some magical ability, and they would sell their spells and services to the people that they met, all the way up to really impressively educated. I'm not going to say impressive, but impressively educated people like John Dee, who I am absolutely convinced was a service magician, because everything he did for money. And he often did useful services for people. So Elizabeth I, for example, you can't get much more impressive clients than that. But he did cast horoscopes for her and predict the future for her. And he even offered to use magic to identify all of the gold mines in England in exchange for all the buried treasure that he could find, also using demons. Elizabeth passed him up on that particular offer. But she did say, if you can turn base metal into gold, i.e. alchemy, go for it, and then we'll see what happens. But she did pay him for various different magical services. So yeah, you've got a real range of people who could be service magicians. And as I say, they used lots of different methods to practice their magic, some of which were more acceptable than others. If you were somebody like John Dee, well, actually that's not true, because John Dee was attacked quite a lot in his life because he used demons far too often for anybody's liking. But you could, for example, have a university education, which was incredibly rare back then, and sort of have very good mathematical skills and track the movements of the planets. And if you use those to harness powers on Earth, or make somebody fall in love with somebody else, then that was seen as more acceptable, because it was kind of potentially science, but nobody was quite sure. Whereas, if you're summoning fairies and talking to fairies and asking them to help you out, then that was probably less acceptable, because there's a risk that if you're working with fairies, they could be demons, and then it all gets dodgy. So yeah, they could come from pretty much any walk of life. They could be male or female, young or old, rich or poor. It could also just be a side hustle for a lot of people. As I mentioned, you could be a cowherd most of your time, but also just like make some money on the side by your magical abilities. And you can kind of say the same thing about the clients that they had as well. I've already mentioned that Elizabeth I employed service magicians. John Dee was kind of the tip of the iceberg. There were plenty of others that she employed as well. And in fact, I don't think I found a single monarch in the period that I look at that didn't get involved in magic at some point or another. But then you go all the way down the social spectrum. So, just your average cow herder would go to another cow herder and say, hey, I know that you're very good at healing cattle with your magic. Can you fix this for me? So clients could be from any walk of life as well. And yeah, I'm not really sure what my point is there, apart from I think it's really interesting. And I think that, magic does just pop up all over the place, and have a much bigger part in people's lives than we thought. And you can see that in some of the history, sort of the more general, sort of wider histories that you can read today. So, a history of Henry VIII, for example, it will sometimes mention that Anne Boleyn was accused of witchcraft, which I'm not actually sure is true. I think he suspected that there was witchcraft afoot, but I don't think I came like one of her formal charges. But it won't mention, for example, the various assassination attempts against him that used magic. And that's a shame, because historians really should recognise that magic was very much a part of the society. Henry VIII took magic seriously. He was very concerned when somebody tried to get a magical ointment to smear over doors that would cause him to die. And it's something that he legislated against. It's something that people, investigated to make sure that he was safe from this stuff. And it was also something that he thought could be useful at times. So yeah, I don't really understand why magic isn't incorporated more into our general understanding of the past, because it was so important to their belief systems. And that kind of leads me on to thinking about today. We still use magic all the time. Again, it's something that we've kind of written out of mainstream life, because we like to think of ourselves as in, beyond the Enlightenment period, very secular, very scientific. Everything is always follow the science. But when it comes down to it, we use magic constantly. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but during the pandemic, demand for psychics and mediums just shot up. Lots of people were consulting online tarot readers, or just buying their own tarot cards, or looking up various different prosperity spells, because they weren't certain what was going to happen in the future, and they wanted to have answers about when the pandemic was going to end, whether they were going to be safe, whether their loved ones were going to be safe, whether they could survive financially. And so people turn to magic when things get hard, even now. And yeah, so I think it's an important part of our present. It's an important part of our past, and it's something that's so complicated, or just has so many different aspects to it, that we need to come at it with an open mind, and also be very compassionate towards people in the past, as well as people now, because we all have insecurities about what the future holds and what our present holds. And we all try to kind of get through in the best way we possibly can. And often that is through magical thinking or actual magical practice, which is the kind of the ultimate message, I hope, that comes through in the book. Magic hasn't gone anywhere, probably isn't going to go anywhere, and that's okay, so long as we're kind at the same time. I think I'll stop there. Sorry, I realized that was very rambly. I can't see anybody's faces, so I'm just sort of talking to a chair. So I hope that was interesting, at least.